In the early 1990s, tens of thousands of ordinary Afghans suffered at the hands of those men, were massacred, women were raped, children killed by these men, by men who got guns from the West, through Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as well. These were men who were essentially hired by the CIA to drive out the Soviets. This woman I met in Afghanistan and spoke with at length, and she was a widow whose husband was murdered and teenage daughter raped by the soldiers of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the most notorious warlord in Afghanistan, who received the most funding from the West. He was famous for dousing women's uncovered faces with acid in college. And he joined forces with the Taliban against the United States and NATO. Today, there are serious plans for the Karzai government to negotiate with him to bring him into government. There are many members of parliament who are actually warlords who were elected, in quotes. They have stolen aid money since 9/11 that could have saved the lives of children and built lavish mansions with them. They have passed laws in parliament granting themselves amnesty for their past crimes and the past crimes of the Taliban. Imagine that. They just forgave themselves. This is the democracy we brought to Afghanistan. They also passed laws restricting the freedom of the press, and most recently a law legalizing the rape of Shia women. They have threatened and kicked out the bravest member of the parliament who dared to criticize them, Malalai Joya. On the freedom of the press, the media law passed by the parliament and signed into law by Karzai allows prosecution of journalists for the crime of blasphemy and for insulting public officials. I know I would be in prison under such a law. There are many public officials I have insulted as a journalist, and rightfully so. That is the job of journalists, to hold officials accountable. 115 journalists were assaulted and 5 killed last year alone in Afghanistan. Very recently, just in the last few days, 2 Al Jazeera journalists spent 3 days in an Afghan prison for publishing a report about the Taliban that apparently was, quote, in favor of terrorism, because they basically showed that the Taliban were ready with suicide bombers and were fairly powerful. Their report was considered a, quote, threat to the internal security of the country, but because they were not Afghan, they were released just a few days ago. But Afghan journalists are not so lucky. This is Parvez Kambashk, who is a 23-year-old Afghan journalist who was sentenced to death a couple of years ago for the crime of blasphemy. His crime was an article that he wrote criticizing and questioning Islam's respect for women. He remains in prison today on Afghanistan's death row, while international human rights groups around the world, even local rights groups, have lobbied for his release. In the immediate wake of the Taliban's fall, independent media flourished in Afghanistan. When I was there, I saw so many dozens of newspapers that I was able to buy just stuck in traffic on the street. Hundreds of newspapers sprouted overnight practically. And I spoke with several journalists who were bravely reporting what was happening on the ground. I have no idea what has happened to any of them right now, whether they are still able to actually publish and write what they were writing. And another victim of the warlord's brutality is Malalai Joya, whom I mentioned and who has been mentioned earlier today, whose highly anticipated book, co-authored with Derek O'Keefe, will hopefully open many, many eyes this fall. She was elected by a huge margin of support in her native province of Farah, and she went to serve her people at a very young age of 27, the youngest member of parliament. She's a social worker. She's not an activist. She didn't start out that way anyway. And her people put their faith in her because they saw in her somebody who was willing to speak truth to power, somebody who was willing to stand up to the warlords. And right from the very start, she criticized the warlords, despite the fact that she knew that they were going to mark her for death. They had the guns, they had the private militias, and she stood up unarmed and unafraid and criticized them. And she has survived 4 assassination attempts. She has been threatened with rape. And every time I say goodbye to her, when I see her, she says, maybe this will be the last time I see you, my friend. And I worry for her health, for her safety, for her security. And of course, a few years ago, when in a TV interview, she compared the members of parliament to animals in a zoo. Remember, criticizing public officials, not looked upon very nicely in Afghanistan. The parliament passed a special law to get her kicked out. She was kicked out, and she's still awaiting a decision about whether she can come back to parliament to serve the people she was elected to serve. This is a measure of the Afghan democracy we have supposedly brought to Afghanistan. What about the so-called rape law? The Afghan parliament, supposed to be the most overt example of Afghan democracy, passed a lengthy bill enshrining the behavior of Shia women, the law signed by Karzai, who was very perplexed that Western governments were upset about this law when they confronted him. This law requires that women, among other things, must make herself available at least every 4 days for her husband to have sex with. Rightly interpreted as a law legalizing rape, Afghan women did something that they have not been able to do in years. They had a public demonstration. Hundreds of them gathered publicly to protest this, and they organized this mass demonstration. It was incredible. It was an incredible sight. The world looked on in awe. The world looked at these women as the heroes that they rightly are. They were surrounded practically by thousands of male supporters of warlords who literally ran them out and called them whores and harlots for speaking out against the law. And the policies of the West, particularly the United States, going back to the late 70s, have been primarily responsible for destroying women's rights and for setting back women's progress. And the men that are in parliament today are directly responsible. They're going to be Karzai's running mates for the election that's coming up this summer. And these policies continue in the form of the rape law that I mentioned. The effects on women are most strikingly seen through the example of a very horrifying trend in Afghanistan of self-immolation. Yes, self-immolation. Women literally burning themselves to death, dousing themselves with cooking oil and burning themselves to escape the brutality of their lives. In some parts of Afghanistan, there have been so many incidents of self-immolation that hospitals have had to open special burn units to deal with the influx of patients. And I want to tell you about Anargul, the woman whose partial face you are seeing in this image. She's a 25-year-old woman who burned herself in Herat in the western province of Afghanistan, where the self-immolation trend is the worst. She did it to escape her abusive husband and to dramatically end her life by setting herself on fire. And this is more and more common in Afghanistan today than even during the Taliban. Her father was killed in the war, and when she was just 14 years old, her older brother married her off to an older man who began raping and beating her right from the start of their marriage. So she endured 9 years of abuse before she tried to end it all this way. Well, why didn't she just seek help, right? Why didn't she just go to the authorities? Shouldn't the new constitution, which says that women are equal to men, have guaranteed some kind of government safety for abused women like Anargul? Well, not in today's Afghanistan, not in Western occupied Afghanistan. As a result of Karzai's fundamentalist pick for the Chief Justice, who is a man by the name of Shinwari, an extremely Taliban-like elder, women today are criminalized for being victims of crimes. If you are a victim of rape, in particular in Afghanistan, and if you go to the authorities to try to get some kind of justice, you are more likely to be imprisoned for, quote, illicit sexual relations than to have your perpetrator jailed. And if the rapist is her own husband, well, then he's protected now under the rape law if he happens to be Shia, and that law is probably going to be expanded for all Afghans in the coming months and years. Welcome to the new Afghanistan, right? Not same as the old Afghanistan, but worse than the old Afghanistan. In the spaces where the warlords are not busy dominating and where the US and NATO bombs aren't busy being dropped on the heads of Afghan people, the Taliban is returning with a vengeance. They're stronger than ever. Their suicide bombings are a trend unheard of in Afghanistan before 2006. And to them, it's a godsend to have the US and NATO occupation not just continue, but be intensified these past few years and to be intensified this year. The more troops there are, the more Afghans get killed, the stronger the Taliban gets. It is to their benefit that the US and NATO have killed more civilians than they have. Yes, we have killed more civilians than the Taliban has. Ordinary Afghans are caught between the warlords, the Taliban, and the US and NATO forces. They have very few options. The former are two direct prodigies of the West, right? The Taliban and the warlords. And so we have ourselves to thank for the predicament of ordinary Afghans.